Welcome back, everybody. Let me introduce our fourth speaker for the day. Rounding off at the afternoon is the Revd Professor Alasdair Coles. Alasdair is a great friend of the Faraday Institute. He runs one of the research projects at the moment under our grants looking at frontal lobe epilepsy and religious experience. Alasdair is an academic neurologist in Cambridge, and he works down in the New Addenbrooke's in the hospital. He is also, since 2009, ordained and is in what's described as a minister in secular employment at Addenbrooke's Hospital. So Alasdair is the perfect example for a church leaders course who spans it both professionally, both science and belief from both a pastoral and an academic background. And it's a privilege to have you here with us, Alasdair.
Thank you, thank you. It's great to be with you, as it were, with you again, because you and your colleagues in the past I've had the joy of talking to about these difficult things. I've come via quite a muddy route, and if I turn around, the evidence is the mud on my trousers. So I'm just reassuring you that I'm not actually incontinent today. I can't guarantee that all the time. What I'm proposing to do is talk for about half an hour or so, and then hopefully have stimulated some questions in that time. And the message I want to get across could be a bit patronizing. So the first thing is an apology. So I'm well aware that there are people here who are who include people who are very scientifically trained and well versed, and for whom this is not a new thing to say. So please, will you accept my apologies? I'm really not trying to patronize you, because I suspect there are some people who are not well versed scientifically. And if there are those people, they may well have picked up the zeitgeist that the brain sciences, neuroscience, psychology has proven that God doesn't exist, has proven that religious faith is just an epiphenomenon, is an aberration, and that if you're a sensible 21st century person sympathetic to neuroscience, you cannot have a faith. So that's the zeitgeist. And my message today is that is bonkers. Yeah, bonkers. But more than that, that I think that for people with faith, neuroscience has a lot of positive and helpful messages. Neuroscience does not prove that God exists. It doesn't prove that the Christian God exists over and above any other sort of God, or that Jesus Christ lived on earth. But it does say a lot of things about what it is to be human that I think is sympathetic to what our faith, and I'm going to assume in my discussion predominantly Christian faith, so again apologies if that's not appropriate, but a lot of things that our Christian faith says about what it is to be human. So that's the kind of introduction. So you may think, well, what on earth does that mean? So here's a few kind of statements with some evidence. So do you're familiar with these sort of illusions? So who sees a beautiful young woman? Right, it's the older men, thank you. Who sees an older woman, not necessarily beautiful? Yes, thank you. Some sisterly support at the back. Can any of you see both at the same time? Both at the same time? Now, just think of that question carefully. Or does it switch? Can anyone really see both at the same time? Because that's very unusual. An unusual gentleman. Yeah. So this is a standard visual illusion. There are many of them, and the point for most of you is that you can only see one at one time. So this is actually profoundly important. And this speaks to the difference between the ordinary understanding of sensation and what the brain actually does. So the ordinary understanding of sensation is that there are things outside you that are real, that you sense in a photographic way, in a realistic way with your sense organs, and then your brain interprets that. So you might think that there's stuff on that screen that can be expressed in terms of wavelengths of light, which is recorded accurately on your retina, which your brain interprets. That's what you might think. So that isn't how the brain works. The brain works not in a passive physics-based way. The brain works on hypotheses. And the anatomy of the brain is such that you can see that. So this is a classic paper which, if you were studying neuroscience in Cambridge now, you would study. This is all about the retina of the turtle. And the discovery made in the turtle, which is now proven to be true in humans, relates to the structure of the optic nerve. That is the nerve that goes from the retina to the brain. It is the primary sensory nerves. So light hitting the retina excites these nerves, and that leads to action potentials going to the brain. Now, the big discovery in this paper is that in that nerve, in the optic nerve, 80% of the fibers are going from the retina to the brain, and 20% are going from the brain to the retina to dampen down or augment the activity of the nerves going from the retina to the brain. In other words, that your brain imposes on the retina itself some idea of what it wants to see. Okay? So this flipping is partly a high-level perceptual thing, but is partly mediated by your brain imposing on the retina what it wants to see. So my summary of that to a kind of congregation, if I was giving a sermon, is to say that the brain is a believing brain, that it's based upon believing, it's based upon hypotheses, that the brain makes hypotheses about the world, which are usually very straightforward, but sometimes uncertain and flip. So to have a religious belief is not such an extraordinary thing. Because the zeitgeist isn't it, that somehow believing or faith believing is a rather extraordinary, eccentric thing that only a small people do. Possibly they are deluded, possibly they have malfunctioning brains. And my response to that is no, that actually our brain does this all the time. It makes hypotheses, conjectures, beliefs. That's the way it works. So that's just a simple point, but it releases people from this idea that belief is extraordinary. So here's a second point, unrelated second point. So old brains are trainable. So in a congregational setting, I would pitch this in terms of the possibility of redemption. So the zeitgeist is that when you're young, you're trainable, your brains are flexible and malleable, and then you reach some point, and the age obviously changes as your perspective changes, when your brain fossilizes. And that's kind of it. And you can't learn anything anymore, and then you get dementia, and then that's it. So that's the kind of zeitgeist. Yeah? Yeah. So the extraordinary thing is just how plastic and trainable the adult healthy brain is. And I just wanted to show you this little experiment, which I think is extraordinary. And this, to understand this experiment, you have to understand a particular tool. And madam, I'm going to use you as an example, where I take an electric paddle and I put it on one side of your brain, and I apply a direct current, zap, like this. And it's not that unpleasant, it's not great. And your left arm goes cha-chung, like that. So I can stimulate your brain through your skull, and I can do it on a big basis or a little basis. So this is your thumb, and I've found the particular part of your brain which, if I zap, means that your thumb moves in this direction. And the more I zap, it actually moves more. Okay? So I've just found that particular part of your brain that controls that thumb. Okay? That's stage number one. Stage number two is training. I take the zapper away, and all I ask you to do is move the thumb predominantly in the opposite direction. Okay, so previously it was going up, and you rested it, up, and you rested it. Now I want you to go down 30 times. That's all I want you to do. So I'm training you in that movement. You've had 30 movements, and I now go back with the paddle, apply it to the same part of the brain, and the thumb moves not in the direction it previously moved, but as a result of that training, now in the opposite direction, after 30 moves. The electrophysiological explanation for this, if I go back to my model, is that the bit of the brain that previously was moving the thumb up has now been rearranged electrically, and more resources of the brain have been put to moving the thumb down. So a wider part of the cortex, and so a bit of the brain that was doing that has now become the bit that's doing that. So your brain is adapted to those 30 trials. And these are minutes, and I'm applying the paddle over the minutes, and you can see that over time, because you've not kept up with your training, the brain reverts to what it was. So 40 minutes later, we're back to where we were. Okay? So isn't that extraordinarily rapid? And these are normal, healthy adults, so you and me, most of us. Yeah. So our brain is responding electrically to your decision to train yourself as rapidly as within a few minutes. And the same principles would be applied if you suddenly decided, to become a Baptist as opposed to an Anglican. If you suddenly decided to read in a different language or play a different, your brain will adapt to that very, very rapidly, electrically. And this is a very old experiment, but it's got a nice story behind it, so I stick to it. So if you keep on doing something for a long time, not only will your brain adapt electrically, but it will adapt structurally. So adult brains, not children, adult brains. So these are your London taxi drivers. And very importantly, this doesn't work in other countries' taxi drivers. So this is after they've done the knowledge, and they've worked for 400 months as a taxi driver. Or sorry, each one is a taxi driver who's worked for a different period of time from the knowledge, working in London, driving a taxi cab around. And there's a relationship between how long you've done this for and the size, the actual size of a particular part of the brain that's responsible for spatial navigation. So these could be people aged 30 or 40, suddenly decide to become London taxi cab drivers, and as the months go by, a particular part of their brain is enlarging, because that's the part of the brain they're now in this very extraordinary way using. And I thought of this yesterday because I was in London and I was in a panic to get somewhere, so I very unusually took a taxi, and it was an obscure location, and I thought I would test this out. I tested it out and said, yes, it's Fitzhandegard Street, number 17. And he said, would that be W1A? And and he had the postcode. It was amazing. So I thought of him yesterday when so for a congregation, possibly for you, I think this is extraordinarily hopeful, that a decision to change one's behavior today could lead to change in one's brain. There is a flip side, because if you, like many men, of my age, spend an hour a day watching pornography, which is, a thing, then your brain will accommodate to that as well. And you don't have to search very hard in the scriptures to see advice about what we spend our time doing. But I think this is an encouraging or salutary vision of the brain that isn't out there. Okay, and we should get it out there. So that's number 2 point. Number 3 point, we're rattling through them, is I think it's important for people to know that communicating with God is a very ordinary human thing. It is not extraordinary, it's not unusual, it's not the province of disturbed, deranged people. And so there are lots of bits of evidence I could put to this, but this is a nice study because, for me, because this comes from a very reputable, hardcore neuroscience imaging lab. They don't do weird religion most of the time. They do honest, proper stuff most of the time. This is a one-off. And they did a really nice study. So it's in two parts. The first part is to say, well, how can we measure religion? So that is actually a standard problem, and it's one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And they came up with their own version of this. So they're in the States, and they took 30 individuals, 30 individuals, as it were off the street, although presumably not, presumably graduate students desperate to make some money, but who had a range of religious affiliation. That was the key thing. And they gave them a huge questionnaire of over 600 questions, exploring faith in all its dimensions. And they then applied a statistical process called cluster analysis, which said, if you answer so-and-so to this question, and you answer so-and-so to that question, will they match in other people's responses, or do they differ? And you gradually group the questions up so that everyone who says this to this will always say that to that, so we'll take that question out because that's not helpful. And they gradually pair and pair down this questionnaire to come up with factor analysis, or to put it another way, 3 dimensions. So their conclusion from this approach is that you can place any person's religious life in a 3-dimensional space based on their answer to a number of questions which reveal whether they believe in dimension 1 that God is involved intimately in every moment of every day, they know every hair on their head, or God is distant or doesn't exist. So you can put yourself in some way on that dimension. Dimension 2 ranges from God knows me and loves me and will never let me go, through to either God hates me or God is a vacuum and just doesn't. And again, you could imagine yourself putting yourself somewhere on that dimension. And then the third dimension, and this isn't intuitive, but it came out of the stats, was I learn about my religion predominantly from words. I'm a text-based person, through to I'm an experience-based person. And you might put yourself on some dimension there. So you can then, the beauty of this is you can start to put numbers to people, which we like to do, and you can start to sort of plot each individual person on this, and you can say that person X is more along here than person Y, and you can start to see whether there's a counterpoint in the brain. So here's the results. Often images like this are shown in Sunday magazines, and they're intuitively very attractive, because intuitively you think, oh, that's a brain from one person, and they're very excited here and here. That's what you think, isn't it? And this person is really going for it here. So just to remind you, I know you really know this, but just to remind you, this is not one individual. This is a compound, in this case, of 30 individuals. It's a statistical map. It's highly, highly processed. So I could change this picture just by changing the parameters of the statistics. So it's very processed. But the summary of this would be, along the dimension number 1, if you ask people's questions in the scanner that reveal where they lie in this dimension, you will get brain responses in this network. If you ask them questions about God's perceived emotion to them along that dimension, you will get activation in this network. And if you ask them where their religious knowledge comes from, you'll get activation in this network. So an example here would be, I could predict from what I know from other things, that this person would be more wordy based. Someone who activated it here would be more visual and experiential. So here's the point. Is this special, this network, or is it not? And if we just asked about my spouse's perceived level of involvement in me, my spouse's perceived emotion, where do I get my knowledge of my spouse from? Would you see anything different? Or is the brain composed of a special God module that is preserved and reserved only for experiencing God? That can be found in some people and not found in others, because that is definitely said. Or is it the case that this is so abnormal that we have to say these people are deranged and disturbed? Do you want to have a guess at which of those it would be? So, does anyone think, I mean, and every year there are people who say yes to this, so don't be embarrassed. You know, does anyone think that their brain has a special module reserved for experiencing God, that experience is so special? Yeah. I've set it up, haven't I? I mean, so this is absolutely normal for the interactions with ordinary human beings, particularly loved ones and close to you. There's not a scrap of difference at the resolution of this technique.
Just very briefly, anecdotal. I'm a clergyman.
Never mind, sir. Never mind.
The church's gone Presbyterian.
Oh, proper church then.
When I felt the call, you are CRT these days, but when I felt the call to ministry, which was a long time ago, I told my friends in the church I belonged to, you know, not making myself up, but anyway, it got around, and I remember mentioning to one of the lay preachers that I felt this call, and he said, because he knew something about my family background, my dad had been a minister, he said, your genes have got you. And I was a bit taken aback, because see, I had this idea of God zapping me, you know, I want this guy for some reason. And so I suppose, and I've had to reflect on that, you know, how does God work? How far does nature and nurture play in assuming that, I think we can assume the call to ministry is for religious experience. I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, I mean, obviously, I myself don't think there's a particular part of my brain or anyone's brain that is just for religion, but I suppose it's fair enough to say that, well, both nature and nurture actually, including genes, probably play a part in the reception of, or in religious experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies of the genetics of religiosity, you know, right at the beginning you have the problem of how do you define religiosity, and so you have to use some artifice like I've shown you here. If you do that and you apply kind of standard approaches, you find that there is a small genetic component, and that is not to say genes have been identified, but what I mean is that in twin studies and in family histories you can tease out a component of nature, but nurture is far greater in that bit. So if I was talking to a congregation, I would say speaking to God, communicating God, or experiencing God is no more difficult or no easier than speaking to your spouse or a loved one, or, you know, working out whether a loved one loves you or not. And of course there's a flip side to that. So if you have a deficit, and an example of this might be high-level autism, where actually working out whether a loved one loves you or not is a big problem or is not possible, then I think you'd have to say, or rather put it, as a minister, you have to understand that talking about God in the way that you might ordinarily talk may not have the same meaning for that person. So let's put it that way round. So the thing that doesn't come out of this sort of analysis is the most provocative part of the religious life for neuroscientists, which is the experience of the numinous, those kind of mountaintop experiences that people have rarely, statistically, where they feel they're in contact with the other, with oceanic calm and peace, and all those various classic descriptions. So this has been the most controversial area in this zone, because there have been people who have claimed to identify the God spot in the human brain, which is responsible for experiencing the numinous. and have argued either one thing or another. So there's a character in Canada called William Persinger, who I think must be dead. I mean, if he's not dead, he is seriously ancient. But who identified using EEG, electrical activity, that people having numinous experiences have activation of their temporal lobe. And he concluded, therefore, the numinous experience is nothing but temporal lobe electrical activity, and is therefore false, and is therefore proving that religion is false. So that's his argument. And then in Toronto and in San Diego were a couple of people who did similar types of experiment using imaging in Buddhist meditators and then Christian meditators, who found that those experiencing the numinous in that context had activation of the temporal and parietal lobe, and said, therefore this is real because we can see it on a scan. And it's really, and therefore God exists, and therefore faith is true. And it's really interesting how science is misused by people with axes to grind in both directions. So when you next come across your Sunday Colour supplement with a picture of a brain showing that, you know, this nun has this part of the brain active and therefore is all nonsense, or therefore it's real, just, you know, apply the, you know, New Testament kind of rigorous caution about that sort of statement and say, you're just crossing too many boundaries there. You know, an observation about neural activity cannot be equated to the existence or not of God. That just doesn't work, doesn't stand any sort of analysis. However, with all those sort of caveats, just a little bit on our work, just in a slide, and then we're nearly done. There is an interesting group of people with temporal lobe epilepsy who have it's a very rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy, who have fits that start in their temporal lobes, who experience God during those fits. And the person who describes this most clearly is Dostoevsky, because he had these himself. And if you wanted to read any book as a result of this talk, and goodness me, I wouldn't recommend such a fervent response, but if you did, then I'd recommend this book. So if you haven't read it, The Idiot, which is about, oh, we've got it. Thank you. So, and this is deeply theological reflection by Dostoevsky, because in The Idiot, he places on earth a morally perfect person who is then essentially crucified. So someone has been there before. Right? And Prince Mishkin has epilepsy. And Prince Mishkin has epilepsy during which he experiences God. And he describes his seizures, and I won't go into it in depth, except to say that in Prince Mishkin, in the character, Dostoevsky places his own experience of being conflicted, of knowing that he has epilepsy, knowing he has a damaged brain, which is leading to these experiences, and yet understanding that God is truly speaking to him through them. It's fascinating. So Prince Mishkin and Dostoevsky refused treatment for their seizures. Now, I mean, Dostoevsky was offered bromide, so it's not a great treatment. But nonetheless, really interesting. And it's very interesting that Prince Mishkin is a Christ-like figure. So the dilemma in treating people with this form of epilepsy is you often encounter resistance, because the people who experience this are getting very significant religious affirmation from their seizures. And I've found that really challenging as a doctor. So just a couple of slides that I think, provide some caution about all of this. So hopefully what I've said is is kind of encouraging about neuroscience. There's some things about neuroscience which I think are cautionary and fit in very much, I think, with New Testament sort of wariness about the body and experiences. So here's a really nice study for those of you who think you are rational machines. This is usually men. So this is a study of Israeli judges, and this is the likelihood of someone coming up for parole being given parole or not. So 80% likely, 1% likely, across a whole panel of judges, whole panel of parole boards, and this is time of day. And these are meals. So as the judges get further and further away from their breakfast, they become more and more grumpy. They have a snack, off they go. Lunchtime, off they go. And this has now been replicated several times, that the most significant thing if you want to get off parole in Israel is not what you did, it's not whether you're female or male, it's the time of day you saw the judge in relation to meals. And this has absolutely transformed the judiciary in Israel, so they have constant snacking. But what it tells us is just how fragile our sense of rational judgment is. And I mean, I don't think any experienced minister really needs to be told that, but congregations need to be told that. And I think this is a really salutary example of just how fragile our bodies are and how we can delude ourselves. And then this is a final experiment, a well-known experiment that just speaks to yet another example of how beliefs can be manipulated. And I say this, you know, that I mean, as ministers, we all try and manipulate belief to some extent. You know, that is our job to some extent. You know, the way we set up our services, the way we use music, we are manipulating such. But this is the Good Friday experiment, or this is actually the replication of the Good Friday experiment, where 36 normal US Boston students were put into an experiment where they were told that they would either receive magic mushrooms or amphetamine here, and then a few weeks later they'd have the other one. So they definitely have magic mushrooms, they definitely have amphetamine, they just didn't know which one they were having when, and they would have some tests. Because they were normal Boston students, they were very religious by our standards, so half of them prayed on a daily basis. So I promise you Cambridge students would not fulfill that. And the immediate object of this exercise was to ask, do magic mushrooms or amphetamine induce any mystical feelings in themselves as you give it? And this had been known about, it was not a big surprise, magic mushrooms do have a kind of mystical, experiential effect. This is the follow-up study, and I'm sorry if you can't read this. So this is now 17 years later. Okay? These same people were identified, and they were asked a question, what was it like to go through that experiment? So you're now, what are you? You're now 40. And you're being asked about something you did as a student, and there was nothing secret about the experiment. You were told what the experiment was. You knew you were part of a scientific study. And yet, these people, so 3/4 of people are saying still, 17 years later, that that experience of taking magic mushrooms was amongst the top 5 most important experiences in my life, which have had lasting significance for me, including 2 people who said it was more important to them in their life than getting married. And that they still draw religious significance from what they experienced. And there are good examples, aren't there, culturally, of drugs being used in the context of worship, and I have no doubt that just like we do on a small scale, there's widespread use of drugs like this on a larger scale to manipulate belief. So what does this tell me? So I think, again, we can go back to the New Testament, which encourages us to be cautious about our experiences, to test experience against Scripture with elders, and just places a kind of nice break on people getting overexcited about experiences. And I think this sort of example, which is very radical, very disturbing, should make us get that message out there of just how fragile our bodies are. Or alternatively, you could give everyone magic mushrooms just before your sermons. Only once. It would then become amongst their top 5 most spiritual experiences. Just think of the growth, brother. So we've got just over half an hour. So the messages I want to get across, and again, I apologize if this is news to you. I'm really not wishing to patronize. But if I was talking to congregations, I would say, be relaxed about neuroscience. It is no threat to belief. In fact, it supports us because it tells us that our brain is a believing thing. It's made to believe that thinking and praying and learning about God is no easier or more difficult than learning about another human being's response to us. So that's very incarnational. I mean, I think you have to ask, how could it be otherwise? Would be another question you could ask. I'm not sure it could be otherwise. The brain, even in a healthy adult, is not fossilized. It is capable of change very rapidly and structurally. And so there is hope if we feel trapped. And if the evidence from temporal lobe epilepsy is to be believed, we're just kind of working on this, I think you can say, well, you can make the hypothesis that every person is capable of having a numinous experience of God, every healthy human. And, there's some evidence for that from the Alasdair Hardy sort of studies, if that's a name that's familiar to you. So in surveys, roughly half of all adults walking the street will say, when asked in an appropriate way, that they have had a numinous experience in their life. So in our Christian churches, those things I know about, we don't often talk about spiritual experience, or at least they don't in my churches. And if over half of the people in the congregation have had 1 or 2 of those, it would be helpful for us to try and make sense of them. So those are my thoughts. We could all go home. Or we could have some discussion. Anyone got any points? Sir?
I have a whole bunch of questions.
Uh-oh.
Forgive me.
Uh-oh.
Because I'm particularly interested in the insights that you can provide.
Do you mind giving your background, sir? Are you a minister?
I'm
An ordinand. Amen. So still enthusiastic.
Very, very. First year ordinand.
Oh, bless you.
Of 2, because I'm too old. So I was really interested in some of the pastoral implications for some of the insights that you've brought to us today, and thank you for those. So I have about 3 or 4 questions, and hopefully they're each small. The first is, to what extent do you think, or what insights can neuroscience as a discipline provide, or what light can it shed on, for example, the influence on video games on people's tempers? I just speak personally. If I don't often play these days, but when I do, I often get in quite a negative state. And I wonder if there are any insights that you could share on that, because that will be relevant for youth and children's work, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is really controversial, and Susan Greenhill has written a book on this. There is some evidence out there, and the evidence is really mixed. So I cannot tell you watching screens all day is bad, and that's proven. I cannot tell you that. Even the statement that seems intuitively obvious, that watching hardcore pornography or hard violent movies leads to those behaviours. Even that is controversial. And I want to be honest about the evidence there. What is, I think, clear is that that people who watch an unusual amount of screens, so unusual means 5 hours a day, because 2 hours is the average for teenagers in this country. So definitely have more difficulty forming relationships and are irritable in their development and have difficulties with concentration and do badly at school. But it has to be quite a lot. So that's about as far as I can go with that.
Great, thank you. I suppose you've touched on this already on the second question, but it was just the influence of addictive technologies like Bookface and news feeds and all that kind of stuff. Does that have an impact on our ability to concentrate? I suspect the answer is yes. From
yeah,
what
I
you
mean,
said.
what you've got to remember is our brain is trying to be good at what you're trying to make it do. So if your brain is being presented with the task of rapidly assimilating visual material and moving on, it'll get good at that, at the cost of other things. Just as if you spend all your time trying to play tennis, it'll get good at that at the cost of other things. So in a positive sense, your brain is trying to become good at Facebook, right? And if that is a good thing, then you're getting better at it. If it's a bad thing, then it's a bad thing kind of thing. Do you see what I mean? So I think the way to pitch this is to say, well, do you want ultimately to be a person who's very good at rapidly assimilating visual things and then moving on without reflection on them? Is that what you want to be? Is that the sort of person you want to be? Because that's how you're training yourself. That's how I put it, I think.
The third question is slightly controversial, so forgive me. So I've read in newspapers of instances where there might be some sort of hookup site where homosexual people might meet and have sex, and there's often a use of drugs in that. And I was just wondering, when you were talking about drug use and experiencing God, is there some sort of parallel in the sense, I mean, I don't really quite know what the question is there, but is there something going on at a sort of level of neuroscience that can shed light on why that particular behavior and practice comes about?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that in a very helpful way. I mean, clearly, when you take a drug of whatever type, and for you it might be red wine, I don't know. You know, we're asking it to change us. We're doing it deliberately to manipulate ourselves. And for my case, extreme, you know, with caffeine, I'm completely dependent on caffeine, and it's a problem. So if I go on a long journey, you know, I get terrible headaches. And so we are asking things to change us. And at one very simple level, taking cannabis or LSD or XD or whatever, you know, is the same thing. Now, why it's linked with sex or homosexual activity in that context, I can't really give you any insights to. But I think we need to be honest about the choices we make to manipulate ourselves before we are too hard on other people. And we do it in church. You know, we do manipulate ourselves and others. And the question is that reasonable? Has it been understood? Are people voluntarily submitting to it?
Thank you. And final question, I'm so sorry. But to what extent can insights from neuroscience help break addictive behaviors like pornography, etc.?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a really good question, and that is obviously a big pastoral problem. I'm kind of interested in it as a pastoral problem and as an addiction. And I think the first thing to say is that very much like drug taking, the addiction to pornography, you know, is on a spectrum where there are some people who try it and are not bothered. There's quite a lot of men in some circles, it'd be like 70%, who are kind of intermittent users. This is across all ages. And then there's a hardcore of people who are genuinely addicted in the sense that it's disrupting their life. Now, I think there are different ways of tackling those different things. Now, with the middle group, who are sort of in and sort of out, I think, like with your cannabis users and occasional cocaine users, you can deal with them at a level of rational and emotional discussion. You can sort of CBT someone out of it, more or less, and then they might fall a bit and come back. But with the hard group, it's like dealing with heroin. You just can't sit someone down and say, have you thought about the impact on your life? Because it's destroyed their life already, and you have to treat them like a heroin addict. And there are, places where that can be done. So I think if you're a pastor who's just having regular pastoral contact with someone who has problems with pornography, then I think trying to find them into these three groups. Well, if they're in the top group, they won't have a problem. If they're middle group, I think you can work with them. But if they're in that hardcore group, then you're not competent unless you have special skills. Yeah. And to my mind, they're as guilty or not as a heroin addict. And an interesting thing happened in this zone. A vicar somewhere in this country very suddenly got interested in pornography, which was discovered by his family, who sort of contained it, and then it became overt in the congregation, and he was dismissed. Bishop sacked him, sent off to rehab at some awful monastery somewhere. Didn't work, come back. And the point that had been missed was that he had Parkinson's disease, and he'd been put on a particular class of drugs called the dopamine agonist, in which this side effect is well known. And no one had put these two things together until he finally came back to see me. And we took him off the drug, and it all went away. Well, fantastic, possibly. I mean, pretty grim, because he couldn't get back into the church because no one trusted him any longer. No smoke without fire. That was the sort of thing. So, one of the little pastoral clues is just make sure there isn't something very simple going on. Yeah. Madam, thank you for being my subject.
Okay, I'm still here. I'm still twitching. You've probably read Lyle Watson's book Supernature, in which he talks about different brain waves. And as a Quaker, that spoke to my condition, because you're very aware in a Quaker meeting of the kind of brain waves that are going on. And if you suddenly think, did I switch the iron off? You realise that if you sit in the meeting and carry on for 40 minutes thinking, did I switch the iron off before I came to meeting? You're actually going to destroy the meeting, so you probably quietly walk out. But I'm thinking this perhaps has implications for religious experience. It's not just the location in the brain, but the activity in the brain. And I don't know what you think about this. Is it all a load of rubbish, or whether it's still accepted as something that genuinely affects how the brain is working, what the vibes are that we give out. When if you've got your eyes shut and somebody walks into a meeting, you can almost tell who it is by the effect that it has on the level of intensity of the concentration in the meeting. So, I've experienced that. And of course, the more you experience it, the more you want to experience it. So it becomes a self-perpetuating, evolving thing that people will spend more time in meditation, in prayer, and more time developing that. Whereas for somebody who can't get on the first rung of the ladder because their brain doesn't seem to be made that way, perhaps it's meaningless. But I wondered if you could sort of elaborate on those thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can't elaborate, because one of the deficiencies of neuroscience is it's a very individual pursuit. So there are no scanners that you can put two people into at the same time. There are no EEG machines that can wire up with two people. So all neuroscientific studies are done on individuals, and it's a real limitation. So there's a lot of stuff about community in the life of the faith that just can't be studied. So I'm afraid we just have to say don't know and shut up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Sorry, I wasn't trying to be dismissive, please. It's a good question.
Silence,
No.
Ryle Watson was
Yeah.
So I just wondered whether there was any science that kind of expanded on that.
Not that I believe in, no.
Crowd psychology has been studied.
Yes, it has, but at what I would call a black box level. In other words, not looking at the brain mechanisms.
No, right.
So at the behavior of a crowd, for sure, but that, I don't know about that.
I recently went to a modern art exhibition in London, and one of the exhibits at the end was a row of television screens, and it was actually using, in fact, there was nothing on the TV screens apart from static at times and wavy lines, etc. But in fact, what was then being heard were people's experiences of near-death experiences. And I believe it's Eben Alexander wrote a book, or even Alexander. Have you had any dealings in that particular area, or have you would you like to comment at all from a neuroscience point of view?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that you will come across, if you haven't already, people giving very clear descriptions of a near-death experience and how important it was and valuable and how meaningful for them. And I accept that at the level of individuals. But we did an experiment. We were part of a wider experiment which has been written up as the SPIRIT trial, which you can look up, where we tested whether people have out-of-body experiences. So in our hospital in Addenbrooke's, if people have a heart attack and recover, someone a day later will come along with a clipboard and ask whether you had any strange experiences. And a key thing is that we've put up on the corridors and in the cardiac unit, high up on the walls, some ledges, and on the ledges are words and things that can't be seen from below. So the idea was to test whether people do genuinely float up and look down on their body, which is the standard claim. So, I mean, not very scientific, but I mean, you must admit it is addressing the question. So, so people will be asked, when you floated up to the ceiling and you looked around, did you see any words or did you see any unusual objects? And this was done in the UK and it was done in North America, and the results are published, and I'm afraid it's a negative. So at the level of floating to the ceiling and seeing things that are not visible from the ground, it was a negative. So personally, that's not a problem for me because I didn't really believe that happened. I believe this was entirely a neurological thing. Now, the question is, should you make meaning from it? Because the Alexander book and other people's experiences is that they encountered God in these events and it's made meaning and it's changed them. And my position on this has changed radically. So I used to be a hardcore biomedical person, say it's clearly brain malfunction, therefore it isn't God. It's just lack of blood supply to the occipital lobe or whatever. But I don't think that's scriptural. So I think Scripture tells us that we judge by the fruits. That's the message I get. However wacky an experience it is, Scripture tells us don't judge the experience, you judge by the fruits. So if someone's, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but if someone's life is transformed in a way that we would say is in accord with Scripture and the congregation and then I would say that's a real thing. And I have the problem that Dostoevsky has, this dilemma of a disease and God, and can the two somehow work together? And I don't say that easily because I find this very difficult to talk about. It's a challenge to my training, but that's where I've got to.
So there's one here.
But if I could just add to that, as a retired psychiatrist, I think
thank you.
No, I'm really interested in what you said. I think more common than epilepsy is schizophrenia and bipolar disorder,
Yes.
where it's really common to get religious delusions. And the work done on it seems to be that, the church has got a huge role, that it's very difficult for a clinician to spot whether a delusion, say a religious delusion, a manic patient is just illness or whether it's real. But actually it's the pastors, it's the members of the church that recognise it. And it's not uncommon to get referrals from a priest or from a minister of somebody who's gone there and they spot and send it to the clinic. And But I agree with you. It's a puzzle. It's a
Well, I
difficult
mean,
one.
thank you for raising this, and if you don't mind, I'll just extend that. I think for those of you who are pastors or going to become pastors in a pastoral setting, not a teaching setting or whatever, I think you do well to follow the example of many North American churches which have their own medical boards. These are big churches, I accept, but often they'll have a psychiatrist, nurse, GP or whatever, and if there's something very wacky going on in the congregation, that the minister can have a quiet word, and that can be part of sorting out whether there is a mental health disorder or whether there's a drug problem or whatever. I commend that practice to you. It's not often done in this country. I haven't seen it done. But interestingly, every year after this session, I get 1 or 2 referrals. It's interesting that, so, if you're like other people, there'll be someone sitting there, gosh, there's this seriously odd person in my congregation. So, after last year I saw, it was really interesting, so a minister, not who didn't come here, so who'd been referred, so I'm not breaking confidentiality, who all of a sudden had felt this darkness overwhelm him, and he could say when it was, he could actually describe it. And this had been interpreted as a visitation of the devil. In his context, that was a reasonable way to describe these things, and he'd spent the last 10 years trying to be exorcised of this devil, and that hadn't worked. And I think, there was actually an alternative, straightforward explanation that we're trying to work to fix, and I suspect there is quite a lot of this. So I think ministers can get things wrong and interpret too spiritually. I think certainly medics can get things wrong and interpret too biomedically. I'm right always, obviously.
I think I was that person many years ago. Basically, I had an experience that I was looking for God, and I actively was looking for God, and then had an experience, and I know the moment that it happened. And I was reading your temporal lobe experiences, and I actually had those, and sort of, and anyone would have said that maybe at that time I was wacky, but it took a good minister to, as far as I can see, I can read that stuff up there and think, well, I felt that was my Damascus Road experience. Yeah. And I needed guidance, and it needed somebody around me to show me this was right and this was wrong. And my children were teenagers at the time, and they come back with the most wonderful stories of, how I told them about Jesus, and all of their friends as well. But I recognise now, I'm going back 30 years now, but I recognise now that was, for me, my own experience of God. And so when we see that, I've seen it across our congregation, various people get filled with the Spirit, and it completely blow them away. And so I find this a little bit more difficult to, because my own experience was that it was an experience of God, rather than something, unless it was because I so wanted it, because I was searching for God. But it lines up with what I believe I see in Scripture, Acts 2. It's not, they weren't drunk, it's 9 o'clock in the morning sort of stuff that I experienced, but very much could recognise what the temporal lobe experience of your patients have.
So thank you very much, and I apologise if any way I've kind of
I wasn't
diminished
at all offended,
what
but
you experienced. I hope, in fact, what I'm trying to get across is actually the opposite, that I've kind of moved from a position where, there were times when I'd be quite negative and dismissive about people who I thought there were clear other explanations to, and I've become much more cautious about that now. And every few months I listen to someone give really very bonkers descriptions of things, and to be honest with you, I've now learnt I don't actually pay much attention to it. I have to put up with all these long reams and pictures of this and this, which clearly terribly important to the person. I'm trying to show interest, but I'm not really interested in that now. I think it's much more what are the fruits from this experience, and can we judge that? So that's where I've got to. So.
Until 3.5 years ago, I was your classic kind of rational man, reached 60, thought that my brain was pretty well set, couldn't really learn a great deal more, as it were. I might be able to kind of keep it going and, put off dementia for a little while, but that was kind of about it, really. And then I had a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And I was in Addenbrooke's in intensive care for 10 days. And when I was in recovery, the neurosurgeon showed me a scan of my brain and showed me that bits of it that had died. And he said to me, Stephen, that's what we call the executive function. Well, my wife was with me at the time, and she said, but Stephen is an executive. That's what he does, really. So what are the implications going to be? And he said, well, they could range from really quite difficult through to, his brain might actually relearn some of those things. And it has done. And I just found it utterly remarkable that that could happen, really, that at, as it were, my age, with that level of damage, that it was possible with really good quality rehabilitation to actually get back to a reasonable level of functioning. Now, my brain is a different thing from what it was before that happened, but it has, in a sense, repaired itself. And I just think that's utterly remarkable, really.
Amen. Amen. I think, when you haven't done this, when congregations hassle me about miracles, and you'll have had these sort of discussions, the miracle I feel most comfortable with is the extraordinary miracle of our bodies and their ability to repair. Not everyone, obviously, but it is extraordinary what our brains can do and what our bodies can do. Thank you. Thank you.
I've very bravely been writing a musical of all things based on the Book of Revelation. That probably shows lunacy of a pretty high order.
Yeah.
But
good luck to you is all I say.
But
I hope you're not expecting too much income from that.
I'm expecting it to go viral. I'm expecting it to go viral. But if Trump can do it, why can't we? But obviously, I've been reading Revelation and for many years, and it is, like Ezekiel and some other parts of the scriptures, quite extraordinary. People before have said that Revelation in particular bespeaks a pretty odd mind, or someone who's taken something, frankly. Can you give a brief comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know what a psychiatrist would say, but I would say that whoever wrote Ezekiel or Revelations was not schizophrenic, because they're highly structured, organized worlds that are being described there. And if you've spoken to someone in a psychosis, you start off half understanding, then it breaks down, then it picks up with something else, and nothing makes sense in the end. It all implodes. So I don't think they're schizophrenic. Now, whether they've had some extraordinary drug-induced or, electrically brain-induced event that has started this, I can't say. Honestly, don't know. The most common cause of out-of-body experience is migraine. Lots of migraineurs are having weird experiences, and I'm sure that those are kind of translated into literature and art in some helpful way. But I sort of go back to where I started on this. I've not stopped caring about whether St. John was eating odd herbs on that island or not. I just don't think that's a helpful way to analyse the theology. It may explain the mechanism, but in the end, Revelations has got to stand on its own feet or not. And in my case, it doesn't, frankly. I'm just lost. Maybe I need your opera.
A modern Harry Potter cotter is how I like it.
Right. Good luck to you, sir. How are we doing? Any other issues? Sir?
This is as much a comment as a question, but you said at one point, brain is trying to be good at what you're asking your brain to do.
Yeah.
I wonder if you're familiar with the definition of magic. This is magic in the sense of occult, not entertainment.
Yes.
The classic definition of magic is the change of consciousness in accordance with will,
Yeah.
which seems to be exactly what you're describing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what do you make of that? What would you do with that?
Shall I give a bit of context to the question? I'm a parish priest. I do deliverance ministry, and I'm doing part-time doctorate with the Federation looking at deliverance and psychiatric diagnosis.
Yes.
I'm very interested in all this stuff.
Yes.
And I think that there is a way in which what we do is about remoulding the brain, to use your language.
Yeah.
I was very struck by the spectrum you were talking about for pornography addiction. And in deliverance, you've got this scale of obsession going to oppression, going to possession, when, if you like, the seat of personality has gone. And I rather wonder whether what we do in deliverance ministry in terms of the liturgy and the rituals and so forth is actually about remoulding. If you like, that's the way in which it cashes out in neuroscientific terms. Any thoughts?
That's really helpful. I think I've only been peripherally involved in that ministry, and just from the point of view of kind of the first stage of working out whether someone is, mad, bad, or sad. It struck me that the deliverance ministry done properly, which I'm sure you do, is a wonderful reframing of the same experience. It's a kind of CBT. So it's not challenging the experience, it's a challenging the understanding of it, and a gradual kind of reorientation.
It's about which story is
yeah. And I'm absolutely, although I don't think this has been studied, it'd be hard to study, but I'm absolutely sure there'd be a very ordinary neural correlate to that, a reorganization. Yeah. Yeah. So all power to you. Literally.
Norman Doidge called The Brain That Changes Itself.
No, I haven't.
Canadian. Basically, it's about neuroscience, and it's about things you've been talking about. I found it fascinating. I have no idea how well received it is in the proper neuroscience world. But for a layman's interest in neuroscience, it is amazing that it talks about things like philosophy and spirit and kind of thing, and the plasticity of the brain and how the adult brain can change if you work on it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alasdair, thank you. I think you've exhausted us, and I am conscious of your illustration with the Israeli judges and our nutritional levels dropping.
Yes.
You may not get out of here. This is, I hope you agree, this has been fascinating and very helpful. Can you join me in thanking Alasdair?